welcome to the Brown Paperbag series. I am with your co-host, Mr. a.kolaproduction.
Thank you. I'm here with your host, Mr. Brandon Lewis.
And today we have Mr. Desmond Hardy here with us today to discuss a number of things dealing with blacks in technology, dealing with, I think you said classism, racism, there's a word, curiarchy, I think.
Curiarchy, yeah.
Curiarchy. There's a lot of things that we want to unpack, and we're going to start off with the Brown Paperbag.
So let's see what's in the bag. You know?
I sure will, thank you. So, what do we got in here?
We don't know.
All right. So what we have is knowing your rights.
Oh man, knowing your rights.
Okay.
All right, so each of us have a minute to discuss knowing your rights, and I'll start it off. Knowing your rights is really imperative, particularly in, well, it's always been important, but I'd say particularly in today's climate, with so many injustices that happen day in and day out. And I'm reminded of the attorney Thomas Reynolds, who was on one of our previous shows, and we were talking about law and so forth, and why it's really important to understand your rights as a United States citizen. I'm going to put it into that context. Because if you don't know, then, and you're not aware, then we'll continue to let injustices happen, right? We already have a system that's been built and maintained where the odds are stacked against particularly minorities and people with lower incomes. And so the best way to, I think, combat that is to understand the law, understand our rights as human beings and as citizens and as Americans, and use that information, kind of like David Walker's appeal. David Walker, prior to the Civil War, wrote this piece. And before internet, before all these things, he was able to disseminate it to where over 1 million people read. He was stitching like this David Walker's appeal within like jackets and things like that, and a number of people got their hands on it, and it was basically used in the U.S. Constitution to identify our rights as human beings, and people were started like really following his words. And so I say that to say that I think that knowing your rights has always been something that's been very important, particularly to those that are black or minorities and those that are impoverished. And the women.
The term or phrase, knowing your rights. For me, I want to say it makes me think about how many people actually do not know their rights. I can say I guess I'm in that boat. I know about 75%, 80%, and I know it's also big for how much you can get out of when you do know your rights. I know how powerful that can be. It's very important, like Brandon said. Across the board. I've actually seen a video recently on Facebook that showed it was a white man that knew his rights.
I saw that, yeah.
And I think about 4 police officers came to his house, and he's like explaining how police officers are a public contracted group officials, and he didn't want that to be engaged, or I don't know the exact underlying dialogue, but it showed me that him knowing his rights prevented them from doing anything on his property because of private property, and they actually had to leave because they couldn't combat the knowledge he had on his rights.
All the white privilege that he maintained.
Correct.
I tried to put it in there.
You gotta put an asterisk in there.
I was like, so what it brought out in my head was like, so a white man that knows his rights versus a black man that knows his rights, would this outcome still be the same?
Ooh.
And that's one thing that I feel like is very important with that phrase.
I like to piggyback off of that. It's a great segue too, because just over a year ago, Sandra Bland knew her rights, and she knew that the police officer who commanded her to get out of her car, and before that commanded her to put out her cigarette, that was not a lawful order. So when you understand it in that context, there's never been a time in the history of the United States where knowing our rights as black people, as people of color, has ever been an enforceable thing. So there's one thing to be ignorant of our rights, but there's another thing where even being cognizant of our rights still does not grant us the same level of access, of opportunity, or even dignity as human beings. And this has been something that has been particular to the United States and the struggle within our context, within the last 200 years or more of our nation's history. But I'd also like to look at it on the other side as well, which is the United States is one of the few nations in the past millennia that's grappled with equality the way that we have. And what I mean by that is, over the past 200 years, we've grappled with equality in about 3 major constructs. First is understanding and acknowledging equality under God. The second would be accepting and acknowledging our equality under the law. And we've got constructs such as that with the Civil Rights Act, women's suffrage, the Voting Rights Act. But then thirdly, and that's something that we're pushing forward with the progressive movement now, which is the equality of opportunity. And that's something that it's much more of a invisible struggle, but it's definitely something that is worth fighting. So when we're talking about understanding rights, it's one thing to understand them, but it's another thing to understand the context of oppressive powers. Thomas Jefferson actually said it best. He said, when the people are afraid of their government, then you have tyranny. But when a government is afraid of its people, you have liberty.
We're gonna cut it there, right? Great job. Thank you. All right. Thank you for everyone giving their ideas about knowing your rights. I think we could have just kept going. You know, that was I think I might have to fight for the mic over here with Desmond. He talks electric. But no, that was really informative. And so again, we have Mr. Desmond Hardy with us today. And quite frankly, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about just how he's impacted me. I've known him for quite some time, since Stone Mountain High School, and watched this brother grow into one of the most intelligent people I think I've ever met. I follow him on Facebook, social media, and he's always posting like these really sort of insightful messages and getting people to respond and debate. So he has his own sort of conversation and things that he's pursuing, and ideas and so forth. So I was like, you know what, I got to get this guy to come to the show because of just the insight that he has on a wide variety of topics. So we may go a little bit of some different places today, but it's only because he knows a lot of information, right? So they had that thing about with master of all trades. So what is it?
Jack of all trades and master of none.
But he's actually master of a lot of things from what I've seen. So
I stayed in the Holiday Inn Express last night.
Okay.
Did you save a lot of money by switching to Geico?
Yeah, that too.
So we'll begin with our first question.
So I'm gonna jump into the first question. Because you're a very diverse man, I'm also intrigued by that. That's something that I like to share with others. So I would like to know, master of none, master of all.
He's master of all.
I'm battling that right there in my head. Relationships is the first area I want to touch on.
Shoot.
But before I get there,
Okay.
where does your knowledge of these areas come from? Is this who would you give credit for?
That's a great question, because I've been asked that a few times, and when people ask me that question, I always say, and it's perfect timing too, I always say my curiosity was really started and honed and developed by my mom. Because as a young child, I always had questions about various things. Mom, what does this mean? Mom, what does that mean? How do you pronounce that? What's this word? And rather than giving me the answer, she would tell me to look it up. And this is back in the day, this is pre-Google.
Exactly.
I'm not going to date myself, but this is pre-Google. So this is back in the day when everybody's parents invested in those Encyclopedia Britannicas. Right. So we had those and dictionary, and that's how you found out what you needed to find out. Sure. And it actually enriched me in a way that is more profound than words can really describe, because we live in an era now where everybody wants to know, but nobody wants to learn. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, in this internet age, it's supposed to make us smarter, but in a lot of ways it's made us dumber, because you have things like the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people think that they're more confident about a subject because they've been able to exercise a 20-second search on it than people who practice this discipline for 20 years. And that's why we have certain things like now where we have people who are anti-vaxxers, and you got people who are anti-science, and you got people who are flat earthers. And now we live in an era where the realm of objective reality is shrinking. And that's what in a political sense, objective reality is shrunken so much because people have retreated to their homogenous corners of people, or echo chambers of people who already agree with them. Mm-hmm. And it's very difficult to help somebody to understand or even question how they know they're wrong. Mm-hmm. Neil deGrasse Tyson said it best. We live in an era right now where people can quickly find out if they think they're right, but they don't have the tools to figure out if they think they're wrong.
Correct.
So, to answer the question, I know that was kind of circuitous, but to answer the question, my curiosity in myriad subjects came from my mom, because she put place within me, or not even place within me, but she really encouraged the satisfaction of my curiosity by pointing me in the right directions. So when you think about education, it actually comes from a root word, ducere, which means to draw out or to bring out. lot of times we think about education in terms of imputing information.
Right.
But true education is drawing out the natural capabilities that you already came here with.
That's right. That leads into my second question. Like I said, relationships. So not just diving into relationships, but two individuals coming together that was supposed to be progressing or building something greater than what you can as an individual.
Mhm.
You mentioned the thing about how people go about obtaining knowledge and not challenging how they got it or the fact of whatever they pulled out of it. Do you feel like that plays a major role or a role at all in relationships? I think it does, but I want to know if you think the same thing.
Absolutely. I think there's a portion to it. I think in a lot of ways we live in a society that is already, just like we live in a society that's inherently racist, we live in a society that's inherently sexist. So it automatically warps the frame that we approach relationships. Because, we approach it from a perspective where both genders think the other sex is some, Martian from another world, and we're trying to get our needs met from these other people, but we don't fully embrace or understand them as equal beings.
Right.
And it leads to a lot of hurt, confusion, anger, insecurity, and until we understand that we're both equal beings with equal amounts of agency, with no preconceived notions of each other and what we expect of one another, that we literally have the ability and the freedom to write the rules for ourselves, then we'll continue to struggle in that regard. One of the biggest epiphanies I've ever had about relationships is thinking about baseball. There's a reason why in baseball, a home run is a home run whether you're playing in Dominican Republic, in Japan, or if you're playing in Texas. The reason why is because they've established the rules to be consistent no matter where you go.
It's a variable that was defined.
However, in relationships, it's the only area where there are no rules, but we have rules inside our own heads about how it's supposed to be.
It's supposed to look how it's supposed to be.
So nobody knows if they're violating those rules until they violate your expectation of what you think they're supposed to do.
Relationship.
That's really interesting. All right, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain a little bit more about, you were talking about, I keep messing up the word, Curiarchy. Now, and you talked about this idea about how we are inherently racist, inherently sexist, inherently classist.
Inherently classist.
Homophobic, would you?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to give you an opportunity to explain sort of, what do you mean by that? And let's say, for example, I don't see that world. I don't know what you're talking about, right? And so all of this just sounds like this ultra liberal guy or something. So not even to politicize it, but like just give me some ways in which you may be able to unveil this for me to where I can understand.
Excellent question. So to understand the way power and power systems work, you have to understand who owns that power. So take, for example, women and women's ability to vote. Women's suffrage was initially gained in, 1912? For white women. I have to throw that disclaimer in there. White women got the ability to vote in 1912. Black women and Latina women got that much later, somewhere around 1968 to 1971.
I thought all of them was under the 19th Amendment, no? I thought
they all were, but it wasn't a protected right for black and Latino women.
Okay.
Because again, they still enforced the poll tax. They still enforced
ID laws and stuff like that.
Literary tests in order to vote.
There you go.
So that's a whole another rabbit hole. But to take the example, women's suffrage. In order for women to gain the right to vote, they had to rely upon men who were already within the bicameral houses of the House and the Senate to be able to vote and pass a bill to allow them to vote. Women could not give themselves their own ability to vote. So think about the power structures in place that had to enable their own agency. That's an example of the fact that women didn't have agency. You can use the same example when it comes to people of color, black people. The Voting Rights Act of 1968, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, Brown v. Boards of Education. These type of legislations enabled black people to have some modicum of equality that they didn't have before. The same can be said for the LGBTQ community as well. So you look at certain things that the president former President Obama did in terms of repealing and abrogating Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which basically protected queer servicemen and women who wanted to serve the country, but were not protected as long as their sexuality or gender identity was exposed. So that gives you an idea on how the power structures existed that did not protect the most marginal people in the society. So when you understand how kyriarchy works, this is the tyranny of the majority that tramples over people that they consider less than because they are a marginalized minority. And to understand how to fight against it, you have to look to and listen to individuals from those marginalized communities. If we only listen to the thought processes of the majority, then there would have never been a reason to end slavery. There would have never been a reason to enable women's suffrage. There would have never been a reason to abrogate Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because the populace, the broad majority, were comfortable with the status quo. And the broad majority is always going to be comfortable with the status quo, which is part of the fight to dismantle the kyriarchy. Is you have to make something that isn't personal to people matter enough to them to enable the rights of other people.
So let me get in right there. Sure. So you described a lot of different, I would say, oppressors or oppressive forces that have been around for, you want to look at the history of context of America, but you say the human mankind,
Right, absolutely.
So there's always been ways to disenfranchise, there's always been ways to marginalize, always been whatever. But so there's some of the movements that you just spoke about within the American context, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Then you had Black Code, you had all these different, right?
Absolutely.
And then you had slavery by another name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get into Brown versus Board of Education. What happened the year after was all deliberate speed, right? Where they said, you know what, y'all can just integrate whenever y'all want to, right? All these different things, right? So let's bring it up today. Let's modernize it, right? I want you to talk a little bit about whether it be Black Lives Matter, whether it be how we use social media as platforms to engage or whatnot. Where do you see, marginalized groups now in their resistance? Because I know Black Lives Matter made a huge dent for a second. Tell me some ideas that you have about that organization, but other ways of just sort of how we're utilizing these social media
or
platforms.
if you feel like those are relative groups to combine.
Exactly.
Sure.
Yeah.
The way I look at it is like this. I think BLM definitely deserves a lot of credit in terms of bringing the voices of many marginalized people to the forefront, and they get all due respect. However, I think in a lot of ways it cheapens the message of the marginalized to just look to one organization, just in the same way that we looked at Martin Luther King as the head of the civil rights movement. There were a plethora of men and women. I mean, we don't even focus on the women who actually were the brain trust of the civil rights movement, but they were. Actually, women were the reason why the Montgomery bus boycott was successful, because women used the buses to get back and forth to those domestic jobs they were working. So again, there's a lot of different things involved there. So it even shows us,
patriarchy is
and it even shows us that
right.
even though we're in a marginalized group, we can still kick and burden other groups that are more marginalized than we are. Right. Think about being a homosexual person or a transgender person who was black in the 60s. You're going to talk about several layers of oppression. Right. That hurts. So just to get back to your answer or your question, to bring it to a current context, you can see it in many different ways. So the way you see it now is in the sense of economic inequality. And these things are all backed and supported and financed by the government. And what I mean by that is, you look for one example, there are 6 unoccupied homes for every homeless person in the country. If you look at all the people who are incarcerated in the world, 1 out of 4 people who are incarcerated in the world are Americans. That gives you some context on the plight of people who are outside of the view of the mainstream.
Yeah, because we're 5% of the world population, right, and 25% of the prison population.
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. And think about why that is. Why are we incarcerating people at such a major rate? That is so, absolutely, you follow the money. So I think a common thread that you can look at throughout history is, is no matter what the civilization is, whenever you have a plutocratic class to continuously encroach financially upon the station of a nation, then you squeeze not only the middle class, but also the lower class to an extent that inevitably revolt takes place. And nobody really wants revolt. A lot of people want revolution. However, very seldom does a revolt replace the status quo with something better than what was already in place. And you can see that with examples, whether it be Cuba or Egypt or Iraq. I mean, the list goes on. And I guess one of the things I can point to is a really great down-to-earth example of the way that plutocracy really encroaches upon the inequality of all. There's a book that I'm reading, well, I'll tell you about that later. But is just think about when you play Monopoly. And you may have a person in your family who is pretty savvy, a little bit more savvy than everybody else, and over time they gain the most real estate on the entire board, whereas they accumulate so much wealth that it becomes untenable to continue the game because nobody can afford to play on any of the boards. Well, what it essentially does is it halts all gameplay because it's such an imbalance between access and affordability that nobody can play anymore. And then people get upset and angry and distressed.
Flip the board over.
Oh yeah, you flip the board over. It's some foul words said. But that's essentially what has taken place over the history of mankind over the last several millennia.
Wow,
and you can look at that, whether it's the Russian revolutions, the Bolshevik revolutions, you can look at the French Revolution, you can look at what took place in Ireland, you can look at even the founding of the United States was based off of that in some short manner, because economically distressed Europeans had to flee to a new land because they were distressed based on the aristocracy of their home country.
That's actually a good place for my next question. I was going to relate it towards the area of technology and our current society relative to that. Do you feel like at the rate at which we're using technology and technology is advancing that we will become lazier, self-indulgent individuals due to technology? Or do you feel like somehow there'll be a breakthrough between now and the future that we won't become self-indulgent?
I think there's a much more deleterious threat involved with technology than just us being lazy and just rolling around being these big tubs of lard and hover rounds. I think the most dangerous aspect about the proliferation of technology in this modern age is the destabilization of labor. And what I mean by that is automation is encroaching on so much modern labor and so quickly that it's going to eliminate jobs. And I'm not talking about just one small industry. I'm talking about multiple industries. When you can write a code that doesn't ever get sick, doesn't ever have to call out because their kid is sick or acting up at school, doesn't ever have an attitude because they're getting paid $5,000 less than the person sitting next to them. Those type of things are at play right now. And to understand the speed with which, the velocity with which technological innovation is taking place, most people don't realize this, but within the next 30 to 40 years, I would imagine about half of our current labor workforce jobs are going to be eliminated completely by technology. So it creates a crisis. And rather than waiting until we get there, we need to think about what we're going to do about it now. And so there are several different forward-thinking people who are already on the precipice of this entire topic that are actually focused on this. So one, for example, would be Elon Musk. He already sees that automation is already going to take us to a place where, so for example, there used to be a time where people were paid to operate an elevator. That's preposterous now. But there was a time where people were paid to switch telephones. So that's preposterous now because we have computers that do that for us. And it's going to be the exact same thing whether you work in HR or you work any type of line job or manufacturing job, whatever it may be. So what do we do about this? So Elon Musk actually introduced the idea of a universal wage. And this universal wage will provide the ability for people to maintain their standard of living without half of the populace being unemployed.
That was deep as ocean, and I was trying to make sure I contextualized and gathered everything that you were saying, but I know that's pretty big, so I want to give you a little bit more of an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this idea behind automation.
Okay,
right?
cool.
And I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is one thing that you discussed earlier when we were first just having a conversation just between the two of us. You were talking about you were into like understanding more about blacks and technology. I would imagine like particularly like the youth and things like that. So with this idea of automation, is this still is it still going to be a racial context where people are not even just racial, I guess classes type of thing where people are left out? Because if this is where the industry going, I would imagine a lot of white people or whomever is going to be affected by this as well. Right?
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
what happens to these groups that are already on Mars? Do we need to just have schools devoted to teaching young people about automation? Like, talk more about it.
Great question.
Thank you,
Great
Devin.
question.
I just threw it out there. I want you to
I'll
jump
grab
in.
this. Yeah, it's like an alley-oop.
Yeah.
Blake Griffin. So basically, it's a situation right now where black people have a tremendous opportunity in front of us right now. And it starts in our individual homes where we got to reframe and reshape the way that we encourage our young people. I can't tell you how many times I go to schools, whether they're high schools, middle schools, or elementary schools, and talk to kids whether it's a career day. And when I go to these schools, the young black kids are talking about going to the league or being a rapper. And aside from the obvious,
Right.
they're not getting the level of mature coaching in terms of
Reality.
not even just reality. I mean, because reality says somebody out of that group is going to do those things.
Right.
However, statistics proves that an infinitesimally small number of people are going to do those things. Reality should really shape people and help them to understand something. And I guess what I will point to is when I was in high school, I had the same dreams. I had the same, not hoop dreams, but football dreams. Everybody wants to go to the league. That's great. But I had an AP psychology teacher, interestingly enough. It wasn't even the hard sciences, it was the soft sciences, who basically did a quick little math equation and showed, look, if you make it to the NFL and you're not even a superstar, you're making the NFL minimum, what's that? $300K, right? You multiply that times what's the average NFL tenure? 3 years? So you're looking at $300K before taxes are taken out for 3 years. Will that really tide you over for the rest of your life? No. Okay, well on the other side, let's look at the top paying majors from college, which at the time were mechanical engineers and electrical engineers. And what are they making coming out of college? At the time about 70, 80. Okay, that's the start. Yeah, that's the start. You've got between the ages of 25 and 55 are your prime years to make money. But if you're in the rap game or if you're an athlete, you've got 2 to 10 years to make the most of your money. If you do the math, going after computer science, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, those are the things that are going to give you the greatest return on investment. So why aren't we teaching those things? I mean, instead we got a whole bunch of our best and brightest who are suffering CTE when we can have our best and brightest that can be creating an entirely new infrastructure for us. And what I mean by that is many Silicon Valley, the company I work for is a Silicon Valley company as well. Many Silicon Valley technology companies were rocked to their core with the president's executive order around immigration, because a lot of the countries that were affected in the immigration ban were companies that these tech companies get a lot of their talent from. And you think about this, a lot of the costs associated with sponsoring visas for foreign students wouldn't even be a concern if we had enough people in the United States who had the affinity to do and fill these positions. And we've got that with our black students, our minority students, our Hispanic students, our girls. Just for an example, You know, even in this city alone, in our location, our branch in the city, I mean, the thing that's unique about Atlanta is Atlanta is one of the few major markets that has a majority minority population. We've got 54% of the population of Atlanta is black. However, in my company, we only represent 4% of the hires.
Wow.
Yeah, 4%. Now, part of that can be attributed to implicit bias, but the other portion is we should be
Going to those fields.
creating such an employment bottleneck that they can't resist but to choose. And we're not giving them enough of that.
I agree.
I mean, they've got relationships set up with Georgia Tech, but they don't have relationships with CAU. They don't have relationships with Morehouse. They don't have relationships with Spelman. They don't have a relationship with North Carolina A&T. They don't have any relationships set up because we're not enforcing that on them. And I'm part of that change right now. But it's got to be more and with all possible speed, because there's a short window of opportunity for us to go after that.
Desmond, we could talk all day. I absolutely love it. Mr. Desmond Hardy, I truly appreciate you coming by to give us, just drop jewels. I mean, we were making a joke. I laid my chair all the way around, was all in for the conversation. So I truly appreciate you stopping by the Brown Paper Bag and just blessing us with this information.
This is a segment where we like to ask our guests to promote or advise or throw out any words or words of wisdom or a book, called a book of the week, any book that you may be reading, like you mentioned earlier.
Right.
You held back on it.
Right.
That you can advise for people to check out. So.
Sure. So there's a book I'm reading right now called The Cost of Inequality by Joseph Stiglitz. And it's an older book. It's actually been out for about 5-6 years, maybe 10 years, I don't know. But it's particularly relevant, especially when you understand the systems that undergird inequality. And basically, the whole book is predicated on the theme that whenever there's too much inequality, it creates instability in systems everywhere. Legally, financially, economically, domestically, internationally. Whenever there's too much inequality, it creates instability. And we live in a society where the narrative around wealth has been so warped that we attribute moral quality to the wealthy, which also creates an inverse moral attribution to the poor. Whereas for somebody who is super wealthy like a Bill Gates, where we attribute this halo effect where they're so erudite and ingenuous and intelligent and genius and brilliant and bright, on the other end of the spectrum, when you face somebody who's poor or the working poor, you assume that they deserve their station in life. And it not only is it incorrect, but it shapes policy. And we're dealing with that right now.
Yeah,
we're dealing with that right now.
Absolutely.
So we have a huge deficit, but we're cutting. We have an administration that is teetering on austerity, where we're cutting social service programs to the most needy and vulnerable in favor of those who are the most wealthy.
I truly appreciate it, bro. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.
To the next week.
Brown Paper Bag.
Looking forward to it.